Welcome to Chapter 4, Part 2 video. I'm going to pick it up from where we left off. So talking about trade between two countries, US and another country, the rest of the world we're calling that other country. And we ended up talking about this four-quadrant diagram. The upper part of the diagram deals with the PPCs, the production possibility curves and indifference curves for both the US on the left, rest of the world on the right. So distinguishing features here are S is 0 in both diagrams, or the autarky consumption production points. Then when we move to trade between the two entities, we get the US specializing in wheat at S1 and the foreign country specializing in cloth at S1 on its diagram. And then we use the trade line, which is the relative price between the two things. In this case, wheat and cloth, it's 1 for 1. And we get to the point where the social indifference curves are tangential to that line, which emanates through the production point S1 until we get to that tangential point, which is C1 in both diagrams. And in this case, the US is exporting wheat, importing cloth, and foreign is exporting cloth and importing wheat. And both of them get to a point outside of their PPCs, so where they couldn't get to by themselves, and they're consuming more of both goods. Or potentially consuming more of both goods. Now that's an interesting point here, because in A, in the left-hand side diagram, you can see where autarky was, 50 wheat and 40 cloth. The consumption points ended up at 40 wheat and 60 cloth. So they aren't producing more of both, but they are more satisfied. So that's a kind of one distinction here that we're drawing. And the same thing goes with the right-hand diagram. The bottom diagrams kind of recreate the demand-supply curves that we had in the second chapter, but just for cloth, and show that the US is importing cloth and the rest of the world is exporting cloth. Some students get a bit confused here because the S's in the top diagram are just the labels for points, whereas the S in the bottom diagram means the supply curve in both cases, S superscript US for the US and S superscript F for the foreign country. The description of what I've talked about there. And the point here is that, we can show that there are gains from trade. Gains from trade, not in the sense that each country's consuming more of each of the goods, but gains from trade in the sense of showing that each country ends up on a higher indifference curve than it could have gotten to, or it would have gotten to, in autarky. So what does it depend on to determine, where we end up? Well, we end up where we end up because of these price ratios after trade compared to where they were before trade. And you can see that in both countries, there's going to be specialization, and then we're going to look at where the country wants to be in terms of consumption, given the current opportunity cost, the price line, in other words, between the two goods for each of the countries. We've seen that trade affects production, that's the specialization. So let's look at the two effects here. So specialization is that caused by the fact that one country has a comparative advantage in one of the products. We've gone through how you identify who has the comparative advantage. In this case, it's the US with wheat and the rest of the world with cloth. So the expanding industry acquires factor resources from the other industries in their own economy. So there's going to be transfer of factors of production, land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship, over from the cloth sector in the US to the wheat sector in the US. Similarly, abroad, there'll be a transfer the other way. Transfer of factors of production from the wheat sector abroad to the cloth sector. On the consumption side, sorry, we're not at consumption yet. We're still talking about production. Second point. This was the second point, sorry. Shift from autarky to free trade results in more efficient world production as each country expands its output of the product in which it is initially the lower cost producer. In other words, the world has become more efficient because we've allowed trade. Just like, when I talked about the example of living with a roommate who has different kind of characteristics than you have, you can become more efficient by coordinating your activities with them. So they would do the cooking and you would do the cleaning. That leads to greater efficiency. Now, in terms of the consumption, we can look at it in terms of two effects. First of all, the substitution effect. So each country, the relative price of the importable product declines. So consumers tend to buy more of the importable product and less of the exportable product. So there is a substitution effect towards the imported product. In this case, there's only one imported product, two imported products. So in both cases, there's going to be a substitution effect by consumers towards, and you could see that in the diagram, towards the product that's being imported. There's also a real income effect. In each country, real incomes rise, so consumers have more buying power and tend to buy more of both products. What's happened here? Well, the opening up of trade has altered the quantities consumed of each product. In each country, the quantity consumed of the importable product will increase. So we've seen that in the diagrams as well. In each country, the quantity consumed of the exportable product can decrease, stay the same, or increase. It depends on the sizes of the negative substitution effect and the positive income effect. So it's the balance of those two effects. So what determines the trade pattern? The immediate basis for the pattern of international trade is the relative product prices differ between the two countries if there were no trade. Why do we have to have that? Well, because the relative product prices are basically the opportunity cost. So if the opportunity costs were the same between both countries, then there would be no advantage to trading because no one would have a comparative advantage. If no one has a comparative advantage, then there's no basis for trade. So in a way, we can, prove the Ricardian theorem, the Ricardo's theorem of comparative advantage by observing this, by observing the fact that if both countries have the same opportunity costs, then no trade will occur. But anyway, possible causes for relative price differences. So why might the prices be different? Why might those opportunity costs be different? Well, first of all, production conditions could differ. In other words, supply side factors. That might be due to the technology used. It could be due to a variety of different things. Demand conditions could differ. So it could be demand side factors. So it depends who purchases those types of things, whether there are downstream kind of industries that require those things as inputs, etc. Some combination of these factors may cause price differences, so it could be both demand and supply factors together. We end up by talking about the so-called Heckscher-Ohlin theory of trade. The Heckscher-Ohlin theory, by the way, is named after two Swedish economists, Heckscher and Ohlin. And I can't remember the first names of these individuals for the life of me, but they were at the Stockholm School of Economics, and I visited there this last summer. They actually have a whole room there devoted to Heckscher-Ohlin with artworks and a sketch of the original theory that they put together, which was kind of neat. Anyway, it predicts that the country exports products that uses its relative abundant factor intensively. So what does that mean? What it means is that if you have a lot of land, you're going to tend to export a product that uses a lot of land as an input into the production of that product. So that's what intensively means. And imports the product or products that uses its relatively scarce factor intensively. So if you're in a country that has a lot of land, labor, and not much capital, then you're going to end up exporting a product that uses a lot of land as an input, so probably an agricultural product, and importing a manufactured product that uses a lot of capital relative to labor. So that's what the Heckscher-Ohlin theory of trade says. Obviously, this relates to how much labor you have, and so we talk about in economics a country being labor abundant if it has a high ratio of labor to capital compared to the rest of the world. And a product is relatively labor intensive if labor costs are a greater share of its value, so it uses a lot of labor in the production of the product, than other types of factors of production, such as land or capital. So Heckscher-Ohlin comparative advantage is actually a triple comparison. It's across countries, it's across products, and it's across factors of production. So this is like a much more complex, a much richer version of the Ricardian model in a way. So the Heckscher-Ohlin model, the setting of it is that there are two factors of production. Now he's using labor and land, but often you use labor and capital. So let's stick with the PowerPoints here and say it's labor and land. Factors of production can freely move between industries in a country, so we have perfect factor mobility within each country. So in other words, if you're labor, you can move between the wheat industry and the cloth industry completely freely. And land can be basically transferred from the wheat industry to the cloth industry. Presumably the cloth is made of cotton or something like that, so the land can be repurposed from wheat to cotton fairly easily. The owners of land are paid rent, so R, a little r, is rent here, and the reward to workers is the wage. Countries differ in their relative endowment of factors of production. So, as you remember from your foundations course, factors of production are land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. But here we're just simplifying this so there are only two factors of production, labor and land. So the US is assumed to be relatively land abundant, while the rest of the world is assumed to be relatively labor abundant. So it implies, this first equation, that the ratio of land to labor for the US is greater than the ratio of land to labor for the rest of the world. So the US has a lot more land per worker than the rest of the world. Alternatively, though, we can write it in terms of the rewards that go to the factor of production. Because there's a ton of land, the rent that any owner of that land gets is going to be lower in the US. Similarly, as the US doesn't have as much labor compared to the amount of land, relatively speaking, its wages are going to be higher. And that's compared with the rent in the other part of the world, the rest of the world, where the rent's going to be higher, but the wages are going to be lower because they are relatively labor abundant. The production technologies used to produce the goods are identical across the countries, so there's no difference in technology. But in this example, we assume that in both countries, the production of wheat is land intensive, as one might expect, it's an agricultural product, than the production of cloth. So we're going to assume that the production of cloth requires picking of the cotton, whereas wheat is relatively easy and you've got some kind of machinery to do that. So in that case, the amount of land compared to labor to produce wheat is greater than the amount of land compared to labor to produce cloth. So in other words, you need more land per worker to produce wheat than you do to produce cloth. You have identical demand conditions, so consumer tastes are the same across countries. We don't want our results to vary just because consumer tastes vary between countries. Obviously, that assumption is kind of questionable. We know that consumer tastes do vary between countries. And there we go. I think we continue with this in the next chapter, so thank you for listening.